Tropical Acres Farms. It is now July 29th or July 30th and 2026.
June, June 29th.
Yeah, July 29th.
January.
Yeah, January
January.
30th. And anyway, everybody, this is Alex, and I wanted to get him on here tonight because Alex has a mango farm, for those of you who don't know, in West Palm Beach, Florida, and we're getting some historic lows. It's been many years since they've been this low. So in Central Florida, a lot of people are used to something like this, but here in South Florida, we're not. And me being from New York, when something happens that's not supposed to happen, people don't know what to do. So if you're in South Florida and you're growing mango trees and you have a question tonight, Tropical Acres Farms also has mamey trees and sapodilla trees and avocado trees. So you can ask Alex about those as well. But we're going to keep tonight's Q&A towards questions only about this cold freeze that's about to hit here in West Palm Beach, South Florida, Miami area. So let's do that. We're going to be for 1 hour. Alex, how you doing?
I'm doing okay, all things considered. Had a pretty long last couple of days as we've tried to prepare for this event. But ready for any questions and any help and helpful tips I might be able to give people in the amount of time that we've got. So,
Now, a few weeks ago, there was a somewhat cold spell. It got down to the low 40s, and I came to your farm the next day and we spoke briefly and did a video about it briefly about how your trees did and how to protect trees in the cold weather. And that obviously was way different than what we're going to go through this time, supposedly. So we'll
yep.
see what happens. This is one of the times we hope the weather people are wrong, but it's not looking like they will be. But we'll see. But we're going to take some questions tonight. So if you have any questions about this cold front and what's happening for mangoes, and so please put them in there now. And first, to open up, Alex, what do you want to say to people that will alleviate many of these questions or answer many of these questions?
Well, I want to emphasize that the temperatures we're going to be seeing in South Florida are going to be amongst the coldest that we've seen here going back probably about 16 years. So if you live here in South Florida and you've seen cold weather here before, this is going to be most likely substantially colder than you've experienced for your tropical trees. And so it's really important that you be cognizant of what's going to happen and try to be prepared if possible. And I realize that not everybody at this stage or given some circumstances might not be able to do everything in their power to protect their trees. But if it is within your ability to do so, there's a number of different things that you can do to try to mitigate the effects of this cold weather. It's also important to understand what the long-term impact might be from this, in terms of trees' health and how it can impact your season or seasons, plural, going forward, how it can impact the mango season, as well as other tropical fruits that we get to enjoy here in South Florida. So, uh, I have some tips I can give in terms of frost protection, things of that nature. But I think maybe we'll get to the questions
Well,
first, I
being
suppose,
that
'cause I want to answer people's questions. So.
Tropical Acres okay, Farm. I'm searching the questions. Somebody has a question. They say up in Jacksonville, what are the critical temps of white sapote, sapodilla, and lychee? I planted all three. I saw survived the Christmas freeze in 2022. And we're not talking tonight about white sapotes or lychees, but you do have sapodilla trees on the farm, so maybe you could discuss that.
Yeah, and I can actually talk a little bit as far as white sapote and lychee as well.
Okay.
Um, Sapodillas, once they get some size to them and develop some canopy, probably have slightly better cold tolerance than mangoes and West Indian avocados. They can survive temperatures into the past the upper 20s into the mid 20s sometimes if they're a decent sized tree. They are going to see damage. That being said, in Jacksonville, you're going to see temperatures so low that it will kill a sapodilla. It will most likely kill a white sapote, which has the best cold tolerance of the three that were mentioned. Lychee's cold tolerance isn't terrific. They can survive as, large trees, they can survive temperatures in the 20s, but they'll see substantial damage, um, which is one of the reasons why you don't really see them grown commercially, much north of like Lake Okeechobee. There are some people doing it, I suppose, over on the West Coast when, they're close to the water. A long time ago, they used to grow lychees commercially in Lakeland, and that experiment ended after the late 1950s. So if you're in Jacksonville, you need to have those trees under some sort of heated structure if you're expecting them to survive. Um, so that can be like a tent, or it can be, depending on their size, you might erect something like made out of PVC or out of some other kind of material. Some people use like for like temporary coverings, they'll use like pop-up tents and whatever you use, okay, you need to fully enclose it and you need to secure it. You need to make sure that the wind does not disturb or blow away your covering, okay? And this applies to small trees too. But you have to secure it well, anchor it in such a way that the wind isn't going to blow off the cover, blow off the tent or whatever you're using. And then you need to provide a heat source to try to keep that temperature that's covering the tree within that cover, um, as much as you can above freezing if possible, or at least perhaps keep it closer to the 30s than the 20s, right? Um, Without providing a heat source, okay, at a certain point, it doesn't matter anymore. That cover, it's still going to freeze underneath the cover that you have. So I want to emphasize that providing some level of heat source, whether that's an actual heater, right? Whether that's powered by electricity or gas or what have you, or um, it can be like heat lamps. That works a little more effectively on smaller trees when you're trying to keep them out of the low 30s or upper 20s. Um, but those are examples of things that you can supply. So, but I'd be very concerned if you're in Jacksonville, you're seeing temperatures probably in the low 20s Fahrenheit. Going to be hard for anything to survive that's tropical. Um, yeah.
So what about somebody's asking Central Florida? Central Florida, I guess there's South Central Florida and North Central Florida, so that will depend a little,
Right. That's
right?
kind of a broad term, but like, if we're talking about Orlando area, the last projection I saw was temperatures perhaps in the mid 20s. Again, you better be covering them and you better be providing them with sources of heat. Now, another thing that I need to mention is that I highly recommend for your in-ground trees, okay, that you water them heavily, starting optimally probably today, but you can, if you didn't already start doing that, you can probably start tomorrow at least. Water very heavily. Um, you want to do that like 2 days before the freeze actually occurs if you can, but that does afford a little bit of help in terms of cold protection. More so when you're experiencing temperatures in the low 30s rather than the 20s. That being said, let's suppose you've got a situation where you've got the tree covered, but maybe you can't provide enough heat to get it into the threshold that's north of 32 degrees. That watering of the tree, and I'm talking about really like drenching the soil, like saturating it almost, that really will provide sometimes enough to push it over the edge that it doesn't get much damage. Now, in old citrus groves, they used to run irrigation, like overhead sprinklers that will constantly hit the trees' canopies with water. And they'll run that constantly from the time the temperature drops into like the upper mid 30s all the way through the freeze. And then after the freeze is over, and the temperature has gone up, the tree is covered in like ice and it looks like it's going to die. But in reality, that water and the process of it freezing protects your tropical tree from damage to their leaves and stems. Unfortunately, that's highly impractical for most people. And I realize that. but it is something that is an option for people in the future, perhaps, if you are willing to put in such a system. And I know people who have done that with mangoes and other tropical fruits, and it does work. You just have to make sure you're doing it right. You need to be covering the entire tree and not just part of it. So, um, probably if I lived in Central Florida and I was trying to grow mango trees there and I had more than just a couple, I might think about something like doing something like that and setting that up so that in the future, when you get events like this, you'll be able to, protect your trees. Now, when it starts to get into like the low 20s, all bets are off, and that's probably not going to be enough to protect your trees from substantial damage or death. Okay. And this is it looking like for certain areas in Central Florida, it's going to get literally that cold. Um, I also want to mention that from what I've seen, this seems to be worse on actually on the eastern side of the state this time than on the western side, which is usually the opposite. So it could be that people are in like Fort Pierce, for example, see lower temperatures than people in Tampa. That wouldn't shock me based on the projections they're showing. But anyway, next question.
All right. As long as you've been down here with Tropicala's Farms, at least the location you're at now, has you ever run into this issue before?
So when I started growing mangoes, initially as a hobbyist, I actually had trees at my father's house up in Ormond Beach, which is actually north of Daytona. And we went through the winter of 2008, 2009, and I had to protect those trees. And I got to, see firsthand what really cold temperatures could do to mangoes when I was sort of getting into them on a serious basis, but I wasn't in the industry yet. When I initially started farming, I started my company out in a property in Loxhatchee Groves, and we did have instances where it did drop to freezing there. I remember one particular time, a very long time ago, where um, the weather was actually much uh, warmer. In other areas in Loxahatchee, it was in the 30s, and at my property, it actually got into the upper 20s. So actually, my trees did fine in that particular circumstance because there was a lot of moisture and humidity, and I had not, fortunately, had not mowed my farm, and there was a lot of tall weeds and stuff, and all that added to protection, such that my relatively then young tropical fruit trees came out unscathed, and I was kind of shocked. I was expecting a lot more damage at the time. Um, so in West Palm Beach, we haven't seen freezing temperatures probably since before I started growing there. Not probably, I know it was before I started growing there. Probably the last time it happened was, like I said, maybe 16 years ago, and I wasn't in West Palm when that happened, so I didn't get to see quite the effects that had on the trees that were there at the farm in West Palm Beach that I harvest now. And of course, back then, our trees that we would later plant weren't in existence yet. So it was really just only big, older trees, which tend to be less susceptible to cold damage due to their size. Um, I also, when I was in college in Tampa, I remember I got the chance to observe some of the trees in the botanical garden there at the University of South Florida after the freeze had occurred in 2010, and it was pretty substantial damage from what I recall. But anyway, we've been very fortunate for the last, more than a decade, and I knew that at some point we were going to get a system cold enough that it was going to at least cause potentially cause damage here in South Florida. If you go back throughout history, going back all the way to the 19th century, we've had periods of time where we've experienced really severe cold weather, really destructive freezes. The last really bad one down here was 1989. I'm not expecting this to get as cold as that freeze or some of the other freezes that occurred in the 1980s or 70s, but it could certainly be cold enough that it can do some serious damage to the tropical fruit culture down here, and many of the small groves and farms and stuff that exist. And our southeastern portion of the state. So I'm definitely very concerned, and we're trying to be proactive about it. So
Okay, if somebody wakes up on a Sunday morning, they're not going to know, or are they going to know immediately if they have damage, or does it take a while for them to really figure that out?
some damage will become apparent immediately. Like if you have any relatively young or fresh leaves on tropical trees, those will typically wilt. And panicles that are coming out of mango trees, for example, will often wilt and sort of shrivel up. That happens kind of rapidly, and it's usually apparent within the first day or so following the cold weather. Um, Sometimes what you'll start to see is the leaves on the more mature stems will start to kind of turn like a faded color kind of quickly, even if they don't immediately turn brown. And then in the days following, you start to see the the browning of the leaves start to curl up. So the damage usually starts to become a lot more apparent in the subsequent days after the event rather than the immediate day after. But it is very common to see some damage immediately. Doesn't mean all the damage is going to be showing up immediately, and sometimes it takes like a week or more for some of the damage to actually show up. Um, but you'll know pretty quickly, um, if you got at least some damage most of the time within the first day or two. Um, Something I need to mention is that if you do have foliar damage on your trees, it's not the worst idea to leave those brown stems and leaves and so forth on the tree instead of running out to prune it. You don't know if you might get another cold weather event that includes freezing temperatures within the weeks or months that follow. So it's not the worst idea to wait and before you go and cut those branches off, prune them off. Okay.
Okay, so somebody's asking, is there mango fruit drop at 36 Fahrenheit?
36, typically, what you might get, you shouldn't see physical damage to the fruit at that temperature. Okay. But what you can get at 36 is you can get a higher rate of embryo abortion. Once you get below 40, um, that will happen more in certain cultivars. And when that happens, sometimes what you'll see is the fruit looks fine, but then like in the weeks that follow, it turns yellow and drops off the tree because the embryo is dying, in part because of the exposure to those temperatures. But at 36, I wouldn't expect freeze damage to the fruit. Now, if you get freeze damage, you'll know it because that fruit will turn necrotic relatively quickly. Like, within a couple days of it happening, that fruit, it'll usually actually start to shrivel up really quickly. And then it, turns dark and then it just inevitably just drops off the tree and dies. I would expect that we might see some of that actually here in Palm Beach County with the temperatures that we're projected to get. We've got a lot of spring fruit developing on our trees right now. It would not surprise me with the low that they're projecting for Sunday night, I guess it is. Maybe it's Saturday night. I got to look and see. That we could lose a lot of, if not all of that fruit that's developing, which would obviously be extremely disappointing for those of you that have grown accustomed to getting mangoes in the springtime here, because it's normal for us to have some fruit ripening in April and May, and we could lose all that. We also have trees that are flowering now that would see their flowers get wrecked, and we would have to wait then for a second bloom to occur, which I would probably expect to happen, but nothing's guaranteed, of course. Um, and for people that are further inland, of course, there could be more severe damage to the wood of the trees. And in that case, it could jeopardize their ability to fruit this year. Um, so go ahead with another question if you'd like
Okay,
to.
somebody says if I don't have any frost cloth, what else can I cover my small tree in the ground?
Yeah, you don't necessarily have to have frost cloth, okay? And you can use plastic if you want to. Now, if you use plastic material like tarps or whatever, You want to make sure to try to keep that material off of the leaves if you can keep it propped off, because a lot of times the leaves will, when they come in contact with that plastic, will actually burn. So try to keep it propped off of the tree, but plastic can work. If you've got a tarp, or you go buy some material or something from a store, um, you can use that in lieu of frost cloth. Cloth can actually sit on the leaves in it, and it shouldn't burn them. But remember what I mentioned earlier, if you can provide a heat source to that tree that you're covering, it's beneficial. Okay. Some people I've seen use Christmas lights too. That's another idea that you can possibly use. But anything, even like a light bulb or something, to provide some additional warmth rather than simply just watering the tree and covering it. Seen some people use like buckets of water, like placing buckets of water near the tree, because as the freeze occurs, that water will give off some level of heat, and that can benefit the air that's around the tree. So that's also something you might explore doing,
Okay,
depending
somebody
on,
said, okay. Did
yeah,
you finish that or did you want me to go to the
yeah.
next question?
Go
Okay,
ahead.
somebody's saying, what temperature would Alex worry about green sapote?
If it's a young green sapote, low 30s. If it's an established tree, they can take into the 20s with damage, but like they'll still possibly survive. But young green sapote trees, if you see low 30s, I remember I grew some young green sapotes out in Loxahatchee. Um, and on one of those frost events, I think we got the low 30s and it zapped them. I think it killed at least one of them. So I would I would say if it's a tree that's just only a couple of years old or less, if you're projected to see low 30s, you need to protect that tree. It's not going to survive, or it's got a low chance of survival.
All right, just so we can get all the questions in, the next question by Caleb about the New Orleans mango tree. I'm not going to ask that question because you said your tree died and you're asking what you can do if your tree's dead. There's nothing you can do about it. Get a new tree, maybe. The next question is, would draping a shade cloth over a Julian mango tree provide any cold protection?
Shade cloth, um, yeah, I mean it's something. It's better than zero, right? It's better than leaving it exposed. I'd be worried about the cloth. Well, if it's cloth, it's different than if it's like a hard plastic, I suppose. But usually, shade cloth is actually made from plastic. So I'd kind of probably want to keep it a little off of the plant if possible. Um, but yeah, it's better than nothing. Will it actually do all that much? Not as well as something that's sealed off, like, but yeah, better than nothing for sure.
Okay.
Uh, Another thing, Paul, I wanted to bring up before the next question. One of the things that these events do provide an opportunity for is a chance for you to see the different microclimates in your yard. So if you can get like multiple thermometers and put them in different sections of your yard, you can see where you have cold spots and where you have warm spots, microclimates as we call them. That's totally normal that you might find totally different readings in different parts of your yard or farm. And you'll have to probably stay up really early to see, how cold it actually does get at your place. But it is informative in that respect and can help you plan in the future if you know that a certain section of your yard gets colder than what the forecasted temperature is supposed to be. And another thing I want to mention is these forecasts can be off significantly in both directions. So it can be turn out to be warmer than they're saying, but it can also turn out to be substantially colder, as some of our friends in Central Florida discovered in the last several weeks. Okay. So if you are projected to see temperatures, let's suppose in the mid 30s, uh, you should absolutely be acting as though it is going to freeze at your place, even if it ultimately doesn't, because it is still very possible that it can, even if they're not projecting it to drop below 33 degrees Fahrenheit. So,
Okay, next question. Somebody's asking 1 gallon potted mangoes. Should they get pulled in if temps go below 40?
if temps go below 40, if you're projected like lower than possibly 39, 38 degrees, yeah, probably. Um, we're projected lower than that, and we took all our 1 gallons into, or are still in the process of doing it, but we are going to have all our 1 gallons in protection. So I would encourage you to do the same. It's likely only going to be temporary anyway, so it shouldn't have an impact on the plant, and it could be what protects it from getting killed, right? So we're making every effort to protect all our nursery stock, whether it's 1, 3, or 7 gallon. We've been spending the last couple days doing that, and we're going to be continuing doing it tomorrow. Hopefully, we'll be done by tomorrow evening. So, by the way, for those of you who are watching, maybe you've placed orders for trees from us. I've had a few people reach out asking if their trees are going to be okay. We're going to make sure that the trees aren't exposed to any freezing temperatures, and your trees should be fine. So,
On that
very
note, if somebody does bring trees in and we're supposed to expect a few nights of cold weather, should they bring them out the next day, or is it okay to leave them indoors for a couple of days?
It's usually fine actually to keep them indoors for a few days, so you shouldn't feel the necessity to just drag them right back outside, bring them back in, and I know that can be kind of cumbersome depending on how big they are. Obviously potted plants can get extremely heavy. So, yeah, they're usually fine if you keep them inside for even more than a few days. Um, and it'll save you some effort and possibility of forgetting to take them back inside again if you're expecting multiple nights of freezing weather. Um, so yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Somebody's asking if you experienced some light damage from the low 30s temps. What are the odds that the tree will bloom later on in February, March?
Good question. So, it's going to depend a lot on two factors. The first is how substantial is the damage? If the damage is, let's say, a quarter of the canopy or less than that, from what I've been able to witness in the past, mango trees can often still bloom in that condition later on. If it's more than that, okay, the more damage there is, and the more leaf loss there is, foliage loss, the more likely the tree is going to decide it needs to regenerate canopy rather than flush flowers and panicles. So the first factor is how bad is the damage? Is it more than 25% of the canopy that's lost? Um, the further you get, towards canopy destruction, the less likelihood the tree is going to still flower regardless of what conditions it receives. That being said, if the damage is light, like I described, okay, you then the tree still needs to receive enough bloom stimulus to flower. Okay, now, right now, given the projected temperatures for the next several weeks, I would say that's going to occur. Okay. Um, there's also always the possibility if they don't happen to flower in, like, let's say later February or March, that we get enough dry weather that they still flower, even if the cold temperatures go away at some point in February, which they historically do. Um, so what odds is it? It's hard to say, but your season's definitely not completely out of the window if you receive a small amount of damage. We're talking about leaf burn, tip burn. In fact, one thing I've seen happen with mangoes before is I've seen the panicle get damaged by cold, okay, that's starting to come out, and then you think, well, it's toast, and it actually keeps on pushing, and you still end up with a an inflorescence. But that's only if it's only the tip of the stem that's getting damaged and not the the wood beneath it. So um, yeah, it's a complicated answer, obviously, but I'm hopeful that at least in some areas that actually do see some damage, you'll still get a shot at having a mango season this year. Other people are going to see much more significant canopy destruction, and then at that point, you're just hoping the tree survives. Um, so another thing that I should mention, one of the things that can happen with mangoes that are damaged by cold weather is they can be not necessarily killed and start to come back, but sometimes the cambium is so badly damaged that they never come back right, and they come back very unhealthy looking, and that can be a long-term consequence of cold weather damage. So be aware of that. You may think that because the tree survived above the graft, that it's going to be fine and you just have to hope it doesn't freeze anytime in the next several years. But I've seen enough instances where the trees just never came back right after freezing weather. And, they just don't grow properly. It depends on how badly the cambial tissue is damaged on the tree as a whole. So.
Okay. I have a question. If you have a bunch of mango trees and they're all the same size, is there any specific like varieties that do better than other varieties, or early season that do better than late season when it comes to cold tolerance?
Yeah, there's absolutely differences between cultivars when it comes to cold susceptibility. I don't like to use the word cold tolerance because mango is not a cold tolerant plant. It is a tropical tree by its very nature. Um, but that being said, there was some good notes that were done on the freezes that occurred, I believe, in the 1950s, down in the commercial sections of Dade County, where they kind of compared notes, and some of they got to see that there was some similarity in terms of the patterns of damage on certain cultivars versus others. And unfortunately, I don't have those documents in my possession, and I don't recall what varieties did what. It wasn't exactly scientific, but it was pretty good information. To really do a proper study, you'd have to do a good survey comparing um, temperatures, knowing exactly what temperatures were experienced by the different trees. I can tell you from reputation, Carrie and Julie are both pretty cold prone, prone to showing, displaying damage compared to other varieties. Anecdotally, there's some evidence Bailey's Marvel has better cold tolerance than average. That's one that I recall from speaking with other growers and stuff a long time ago. But unfortunately, I don't have a chart I can hand you and show you and say, like, okay, these ones start to show damage at 32, these start doing it at 31. And I certainly wouldn't plant mango trees, um, with the expectation that one has more cold tolerance than the other. And that's like determining what variety I'm going to plant. I would just assume that they're going to start to see damage once you get into the low 30s, regardless. So.
Okay. Okay. Somebody said they're in Tampa, 9B. How long can you keep mango trees covered with the frost cloths? I have mine wrapped with a 1.75 watt Xmas tree lights. I run all night.
How long can you keep them under frost cloth?
Yeah.
I mean, usually at least like several days, if not a week, long enough to get you past the freeze. Yeah. Now, one thing I need to mention, depending on what kind of covering and what kind of heater you use, there is such a thing as overheating them, okay? You don't want those temperatures inside your covering or your greenhouse or whatever you're using to get too high. So definitely monitor for that. Remove the heat source when you don't need it. Um, because it can get quite hot in an enclosed space when you're providing heat to it. Okay, so don't forget to do that. Don't let it get too hot. Unlikely to get too hot with this kind of cold weather that we're getting right now, but sometimes things warm up quick, and if you don't go back and remove the heat or remove the cloth or whatever, and you just forget, you can potentially cook your tree in certain situations. So
Yes. On that note, if you leave it on and then the sun comes out during the daytime, that's where you run into trouble because the
yeah.
sun is where the heat comes. So that's be careful with that. Now, so another question says, a lot of people are saying what they're doing. What if somebody's asking about star fruit, but we're not tonight. We're just talking about what Alex is growing here. Uh,
Well, yeah, starfruit trees, definitely tropical enough to merit covering if you can. Cold tolerance, probably a little better than a mango. Oh, another tip, another thing you can do if you're not able to cover the whole tree, you can wrap the trunk in cloth, or I've seen people use cushions before. And the idea behind that is, well, you might lose the canopy, but you don't lose the trunk above the graft union. Okay. So I've certainly seen people doing that, and that might be the difference between your tree surviving above the graft and not. So,
Gary Zill made a video today, and he was using newspaper to do that.
okay.
He says
Well,
he's seen it work.
yeah. And obviously, they have a lot of trees they need to protect. That's the source of the budwood by which they produce trees. And same thing for us. Now we're a little bit more eastward. So I'm hoping there is going to be some trees that I cover, but it's going to be a few small trees. Most of our trees are going to be totally exposed and on their own. So we'll see how bad the damage is. I don't have the capacity or the labor or all that stuff or the supplies to cover the hundreds of trees that we have in the ground. We'll just have to live with what happens. But there are a few things I'm covering up, a couple of very young mamey sapote trees, a couple young mangoes as well that we want to make sure we save if we can. Um, and then otherwise, we'll find out this coming week how severe it was. So,
Okay. Somebody said in Orlando, should I cover my garcinias, acharu, and
yeah,
lemon drop? Yeah, I would cover
yes,
them.
big time, yes. Yeah.
Uh, let's see. Uh,
Another thing I want to emphasize, it's going to be very windy. I know I mentioned that earlier. So make sure, again, make sure that any coverings and protective measures you're taking are properly secured. One thing about wind, um, we're going to get a lot of wind in West Palm, for example. Sometimes when it's real windy, it can prevent frost from showing up for a little bit. So it's not always the worst thing in the world, but it can also dry your trees out quite easily. So that's one of the reasons why you want to make sure that trees are hydrated. You've watered them in their root zones, before the event has happened.
okay. And a lot of people here from other areas saying what they've done, what works. So everybody look at those comments. They'll be up even after the video. Uh, Somebody was just asking about your young mameys, and he just answered that.
Right. So we have a couple that we're going to try to protect, and I can even tell you which one. I think it's our Vidal Redondo and our Aquil Especial are both pretty small, small enough that they could potentially be killed by the temperatures we're going to see. My other mameys, I mean, the worst part about it will be losing the fruits and flowers potentially to the frost because mameys take a while to fruit from flowering. So if we lose the fruit that is on them now, it's going to be a while before we see fruit from them again, like, a year and a half or something like that or longer. But I would still expect them to survive. I am watering them pretty heavily over these next few days. So, so hopefully we won't lose any of these unique varieties we grow. We also have some that were given to us recently in pots um, by Zane and Rob that we're keeping in the garage so they won't experience any freezing temperatures. These are pretty rare selections, as well as a new green sapote. So we're going to definitely be taking extra care of those, make sure they don't get killed. So,
Now, if somebody just planted 1 gallon or 3 gallon plants within the last 6 months, and they don't have a ton of plants in their yard, do you
yeah.
think it's worth digging up, putting in a pot, and bringing it in the house?
Oh, some people do that, and at that size, they usually transplant pretty well. Now, one thing I'll say about transplanting trees, mangoes in particular don't like transplanting during cold weather. So you do run some risk of disaffecting the tree by trying to transplant it now. But at 1 or 3 gallon size, you can usually recoup the entire root system without disturbing it too much. Once they get larger than that, it becomes a little more troublesome. But like at that size, you could do it, bring them inside, and it's much better than leaving them outside in freezing temperatures. At that size, young mango trees can get killed at, low 30s. It does not take 20s to kill a 1 or 3 gallon plant, depending on the duration of the freeze. So,
Okay. Somebody's asking, what should we be spraying on our trees to prevent disease after a cold event? Uh, after the cold event.
Prevent disease? Well,
Anything different
I,
than what normally?
it's usually not my priority. It would not be my priority after a cold event. I'd want to see what kind of damage occurred first. One thing that you'll sometimes see that you'll think is disease and it's actually just damage is you'll see gummosis on trees that have been damaged by cold weather, which means that you'll see like what looks like sap exuding from the sides of the bark. Actually not disease, it's actually damage that's occurred. And, trees that are displaying that are usually in some serious trouble. If you've got like a disease problem on your trees, you might want to wait until you've had a chance to survey how severe the damage is to your tree because you might be treating foliage that's going to be dying anyway. So, I would hold off on treating for disease at least a week or two after the freeze event has occurred. But that's my thoughts on that.
Okay, Bobby's asking, how would you protect a mango tree that is 8 feet tall and 10 feet wide?
Sure. Well, number one, I'd be watering that tree heavily in the lead up to the freeze and the 2 days before. Just saturate the soil. If you don't have overhead irrigation, I don't, to cover the leaves, you would probably want to, at that size, I guess you could possibly put a pop-up tent over the tree. What was the size? 8 feet by something?
8 feet
Well,
by 10
yeah,
wide.
you might be able to put a pop-up tent over it and then cover up the sides of the pop-up tent with like clear plastic, or tarps or whatever, and just secure it, fasten it real tightly, anchor it down with cinder blocks or brick or whatever you've got, concrete or something like that. And then I'd put a heater of some kind, you know, if you don't have electrical access, get a gas one inside of the tent to make sure that the temperature is kept above freezing. That would be like the optimal way to do it. Okay. And I realize that's impractical when people have a lot of trees and stuff, but if you're only trying to protect a few, it's not a bad idea. And one of the things that this event raises is, um, we know a lot of people now in what we'll call Central Florida, South Central Florida, areas that, you know, didn't used to historically grow mango trees in their yards, like Orlando and stuff like that, have probably planted a lot of trees at this point in the last decade plus. I don't think it's a bad idea to grow some mangoes, even if you have yard space for quite a few, to grow one or two or three in a container as sort of an insurance measure so that if you do get an event like this where it becomes difficult over time to cover your trees, you can at least move some of them, you know, into protected conditions with relative ease. And then you can still have a shot at getting some mango fruit that year. Um, so that's something that people might consider going forward, even if you do prefer to grow most or all of your trees in the ground, is to maintain a few in large pots because they're transportable and you can move them because eventually it does become extremely impractical to protect these things. When they're young and small, a few feet tall and wide, not so challenging. But when we're talking about trees that are reaching, 10 plus feet in height or spread, it becomes progressively more difficult to protect them. So, just
Sure.
a
Well,
thought.
you mentioned a couple of times to saturate the trees in water. Uh, let's say, so what exactly does that mean? Do you take a hose, you stay near the
Yeah,
water for an hour, for 8 hours? What does that mean?
yeah. Well, I don't know if you have to do it necessarily for 8 hours, but enough that the soil is wet several feet down and underneath the whole potential drip line of the canopy. You want a real wet soil, right? Way more than you would normally water it, and keep it like that up until the freezing event occurs. Okay. That's what I'm talking about. So, would you have to run a hose for 8 hours? No. In fact, in a certain circumstance, that might lead you to have standing water underneath your tree. But you just want to get all the soil super, super wet to a point where like you dump a bucket of water and it takes a little while for that water to actually drain because when you normally do it here in South Florida, it drains really quickly because our soil is very sandy. Um, so that's what I'm talking about. And really, that's only a measure you need to take up until the point that the freeze has happened. And then afterwards, you can back off on the watering a little bit because the tree's obviously going to be sitting in some pretty wet soil. But it's also important to remember that you still have to water your young trees, even after a freeze has occurred. Sometimes they're quite desiccated from wind. That can happen. And so it's a little complicated because you don't want your trees sitting in really wet feet for a long period of time and have a lot of cold weather at night. That's how root rot actually occurs. But since this is a temporary thing, all right, it's okay to get the soil real wet for, a few days. So then they
All
should be
right.
okay.
Well, Saturday night going into Sunday. Well, actually, it looks like right now it's 40% chance of rain. Can rain help or hurt the situation?
Usually, in my experience, rain has been beneficial actually, because it raises up the humidity in the area, and typically the severity of the damage once you get into the low 30s isn't as bad as it would be if it's perfectly clear and dry. Um, but you know, there's also ways that could be, um, that could be not the case. So there's a lot of factors that come into play when it comes to cold damage. So the humidity, moisture, dew point, right? So those are all factors that could happen. So
What about avocados? People are asking about that. I mean, obviously some avocados are more cold hardy than others, but should they treat avocados the same advice you're talking about mangoes or any different?
avocados, it's going to depend. There are of course different land races of avocado. The least cold tolerant of which is the West Indian sort. Then you've got Guatemalan types, which are somewhere in between. And then the most cold hardy ones are the pure Mexican avocados. If you've got a young avocado tree, a real young one, like a 1 or 3 gallon or something like that, I would protect it regardless of what kind it is, even up to maybe a few feet in height and spread. Beyond that, if it's an established tree, um, you know, established Guatemalan types are usually cold hardy to like almost the mid 20s Fahrenheit. Mexican types are probably almost 20 degrees, sometimes less than that. Big ones have survived less than that. But like a West Indian type, like a Dupuy or a Russell or a Miguel, those are going to get damaged at the same temperature mango trees will. Now, these West Indian Guatemalan hybrids like Monroe and Choquette and a number of other Florida varieties probably have slightly better cold tolerance than a pure West Indian, but not by much from what I've been able to personally observe. So I would sort of treat those like you would mangoes as well. It's the pure Guatemalan types like Haas and some of the Haas derivatives that have a little bit better. Bacon is another one that has better cold tolerance than a West Indian avocado. The real super cold hardy ones are like Mexicola Grande, some of these ones from Texas. Those have incredible cold tolerance and have survived in areas well north of where we happen to be. So,
Okay. Somebody said, will these temperatures entice some of your difficult to flower Indian varieties to perform at your farm?
yeah, that's a very good question and something we're actually wondering about ourselves. So, we have several varieties that have either flowered very poorly for us or haven't flowered at all. Of course, the first thing we hope for is that there's no damage, right? To begin with, or at least minimal damage. But my thinking is if those particular specimens don't get damaged in this event, there is definitely a good shot that they will flower. One of them is the dashiri, for example. That's only flowered once for us a couple of years ago, and the fruit was outstanding. We didn't get any fruit from it last year. It was one of our only mango trees that totally failed to bloom in 2025. We have another one called Sapodilla now, which is from northern India. It's only produced a couple panicles for us so far in the last couple of years. That's one that would possibly have a chance to flower because we're getting several weeks below 60. That's the projection, at least. And I think that's probably going to be enough to push some of these to bloom. How substantially will they bloom? We'll see. And that's only if they don't get damaged real bad. So let's hope that they don't. But it is going to be very interesting. There's also a few others, by the way, I forgot to mention that we're growing, and we're very interested to see if they can respond in these conditions with some bloom. Because I think if they bloom, I'm pretty confident we'll get fruit from them. So
Somebody is asking, they said they got 6 foot trees that they planted 4 months ago, 25 gallons. Uh, they put burlap wrap around the trunk and will mulch around heavily the water. Is this going to be enough? And on that question, we didn't mention mulch. Does mulch help the situation?
mulch will help protect the trees if you're stacking it up against the trunk, which I don't normally recommend for regular practice. But in this situation, I've seen people use sand, I've seen people use mulch, but the bottom line is you're like burying the trunk in it, right? To protect the tree. Mulch that is actually occurring in normal circumstance underneath the canopy and not like up against the trunk. It's funny, but the experiments that have been done have shown that the trees that are mulched have more cold damage than the unmulched trees. So take that into consideration. But as far as protecting the trunk, it's not a bad idea to bury it in mulch. All right. Um, as far as what level of protection doing all that stuff will offer, it's protective at like 32, 31, low 30s, I'm saying basically, for short intervals of time. When you get below that, it's not necessarily enough to, prevent the tree from getting significant damage or damage of some sort. So some of these measures without supplemental heat can only go so far. So don't, you got to watch and see what you're projected to get, and of course, see what you actually end up getting. But
Okay, speaking of heat, a couple of days ago it got up to 89 degrees. So
yeah.
if it goes, we have this cold front and it goes hot real quick, does that make a difference in the recovery or the damage if it gets too hot too quick after a cold front, or it doesn't usually make a difference, or is that a good thing?
So the one thing, and I've looked at the projected forecast for the next couple weeks, doesn't look like it's going to get particularly warm, at least down here. But to answer that question, the one benefit in some respects is that warm weather, if you've got a tree that needs to recover canopy after losing a lot to damage, warm weather can sometimes spur the tree to flush some growth and start to begin the process of recovering its canopy. As far as making it worse, it's not typically going to do that. Um, it can actually, in certain circumstances, let's suppose you have some peripheral damage on the tree and you're hoping for a bloom to occur on the undamaged portion. If you get warm temperatures, unseasonably warm temperatures in the weeks that follow, it can actually discourage that tree from flowering, even though it received cold weather, right? That you would hope, stimulated the rest of its buds to flower. So it's a complicated topic, but as far as like physical damage to the tree, if you get warm temperatures after a cold front, it's not going to make it worse. No.
Okay, next question is, Alex, are you thinking this will be a terrible season for Florida mangoes?
I don't know. I can't predict how extensive the damage is going to be. I'm fairly confident, unfortunately, for those of you in the central part of the state growing mangoes, your backyard mango crops, unless the trees are exceptionally well protected, is probably going to be quite poor. That being said, down here, obviously, most of the mango production is in the southern part of Florida. Almost all the commercial acreage can be found in Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and Lee counties. My thinking is Lee County shouldn't get damaged too much by this from the projections I've seen. But how will things go in western Palm Beach, in western Miami-Dade? We'll see. but I am not of the opinion that this is going to completely wreck the mango season. I think it will have a negative impact on it, but how negative is going to come down to how low do the temperatures get in those primary commercial growing areas. Um, and we'll see. We don't know. These temperatures can be off in different directions, right? If it gets colder than they're projecting for us, for example, in West Palm Beach, then you're looking at a totally different deal where it could severely impact the season as a whole. We could end up with very little fruit. Um, so, I'm optimistic that we will still have mangoes in 2026. Okay. But it would be foolish for us to think that it's going to be a spectacular crop throughout the state, knowing that a big chunk of the state north of Lake Okeechobee is probably going to have essentially no mango season and might not have one for a couple of years, depending on how severe the damage is. Um, so we'll find out. And hopefully, people can do as much as they can to try to protect their trees and hold on to whatever kind of crop they might end up getting. I would say that the coastal zones should be good. People that are like right along the coast, in maybe all the way up to the Treasure Coast on the side, and on the western side, Bradenton will probably be fine. Sarasota along the coast, Venice, uh, Naples, Fort Myers, Pine Island should be fine. I think we'll do okay. So the areas in question are once you get to like where we're at and inland, you know, how bad is the damage going to be? So
Okay, two more questions, and then we're going to call it a night here. So one question is to what you just said. Somebody said, could these weather conditions cause the price of Florida grown fruit to increase?
I don't doubt that I don't doubt that they will. You know,
You
it,
don't
it
doubt that they will. You mean that means yes to the
yeah, yeah,
question.
I think that most likely they will because one of the things with Florida mangoes is that there's a lot of participation in our industry from people that are essentially backyard growers, right? That sell their fruit online, or sometimes at markets and whatever. If those people are not able to participate on as large of a scale as they typically would, it's going to drive the scarcity up. You're going to see farms that incur damage, possibly, that are going to, want to recoup whatever they can from the crop that they do have. So it will have an impact on the price of the fruit, generally speaking in Florida. How significant is going to depend on what kind of damage we see, especially in Palm Beach and Miami-Dade counties. Um, but it's definitely going to have a negative impact. Let's hope it's not too bad, right? Let's hope that there's still a lot of people in Florida that'll have mangoes and they'll be at least accessible to people and that it won't cause like a super high inflation in the price so that, it's out of reach for some certain classes of consumers. So,
Okay.
yeah, I feel good about the West Coast. I think the Southwest Coast might make it out better than the East Coast this time. So.
Okay. Somebody said, how can it be colder in West Palm Beach than Juneau, Alaska? Interesting.
Crazy, right? And
Yeah.
it's weird. I actually just mentioned how like normally the pattern here in Florida is that the West Coast gets colder than the East Coast, but in this particular event, I think that the East Coast is actually going to be colder than the western part of Florida. But yeah, isn't that crazy? Like parts of the country that are normally so much more colder than we are here are going to be warmer than we are actually because this air mass has moved down here and is going to be parking itself over Florida for a couple of days. So that's just how cold air works and how it moves, and it's not static, right? But we'll warm up quick, and I would hope that we don't see another event like this for the remaining part of winter, and I would hope we won't see one like this for a very long time. Like I mentioned, it's been like 15, 16 years since we've seen these kind of temperatures down here in this neck of the woods. Maybe we'll go a while before we see it again. Historically, I would, not rule it out happening again in the future. And I wouldn't rule out something worse happening at some point, something like 1989 or 1982 or whatever, when some of those other really bad ones happened. And those ones, they're they're like dropping an atomic bomb on the mango industry and the tropical fruit industry in general, right? Not just mangoes, anything tropical. And hopefully we don't get one of those for a very long time, but history says it will happen at some point. So,
Now, from a disease standpoint, can it help kill certain bacterias or beetles, let's say, the beetle that's hitting the avocados or something? Can it wipe those out, or is it not cold enough for something like that?
well, like with avocados, for example, and laurel wilt, they've found that the disease is primarily now vectored by native ambrosia beetles, which probably aren't going to get wiped out by those temperatures. I don't know if the red bay ambrosia beetle would or not. That I'm not sure because I don't know too much about the entomology behind them and what kind of temperatures they can tolerate. But as far as disease goes, I mean, you usually see a reduced level of anthracnose when it's really cold. Anthracnose prefers warm, humid weather. But powdery mildew doesn't really care about temperature so much, and so you can still see plenty of powdery mildew when the temperatures are really cold. In fact, I noticed some today on some inflorescences, panicles that I hadn't sprayed. And so it's definitely out there. Otherwise, like there isn't really too much of benefit provided by the cold weather as far as, suppressing disease in the long run. Any effect is extremely temporary when it comes to anthracnose. So,
Now, I know there are two different monsters, but what's worse for Florida fruit trees, hurricane or cold dipping in cold?
oh, I would say a freeze is much worse because it's going to impact a broader area. Hurricanes, it's usually um, I hate to use the word narrow, but like, it's a smaller section of geography that's directly impacted by them, as destructive as hurricanes can be, right? Freezes can cover a vast section of the state in comparison and kill trees, that are 200, 300 miles away from one another, seemingly. Whereas a hurricane is less likely to do that. So freezes certainly have been historically much more destructive to our industry than hurricanes have been, as bad as hurricanes can be, and obviously the perspective of people over on like Pine Island, for example, that got impacted by Hurricane Ian is going to be a little different, right? But for the broader mango geography and tropical fruit geography of Florida, freezes are bad news, really bad. We don't want them. So.
Okay, a last question of the night is somebody says, should I just wrap my trees with fluorescent Christmas lights? Will that help?
It's better than nothing as long as you're covering them up, but it's going to depend on how low your temperatures are projected to be. If you're just using Christmas lights and you're getting down into like mid 20s or low 20s, like some areas of Florida are being projected to, it's probably not going to be enough. You're going to want a stronger heat source. If you're talking about high 20s, low 30s, might be enough. It's certainly better than not doing it at all. Okay, so if that's all you've got as an option, go out there and do it and make sure to secure the covering so it doesn't get blown off by the wind. Very, very, very important. We're going to see winds that are 20 something miles an hour or more. That's very easy to, it's easy for winds like that to wreck your covering, right? So anchor them down good, make sure they're secure.
All right, Alex, thank you for your time tonight. And I guess maybe we'll come back sometime next week and get an estimate of what happened and
Yeah, it's going to
talk
take a
about
little bit of
recovery.
time to figure out just how extensive any damage was. And we're going to kind of have to do sort of an informal survey, amongst the other people in our industry, as well as hobbyists and whatnot, to see and compare notes. Hopefully, we can compare notes and see how things went. So let's hope for the best.
That's how we learn. So
Yeah.
thank you, Alex, everybody. Tropical Acres Farms, that's his website.com. And he has trees for sale still. So Get them on there and check that out. Thank you everybody for watching. Please stay tuned to Fruitful Trees for updates on videos from all of the local farms because I'm going to be out there like a news reporter, finding out what happened and how it's going. So subscribe if you're not subscribed, and thank you for watching here. Have a great night, everybody, and don't worry and stress. Just react. Just go out and do what you got to do. Have a blessed night, everybody, and keep growing. Okay. All right, we're off. Thank you very much, man. We had over like 215 people on there.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
that's very good.
hopefully they